Emptiness isn't loud. It shows up slowly, disguised inside routine, fake smiles, and days that go by way too fast. It's when everything keeps spinning: work, conversations, social media, but inside, something feels suspended, missing, a kind of existential silence. It's not just sadness, it's not just exhaustion, it's the feeling of being in the world, but not really belonging to anything, of living a life that seems already written, but without an author, without a why. This emptiness isn't a mistake, it's part of the human condition. It's in this quiet space that awareness is often born, and with it, crisis and transformation. Today we're not going after easy answers. We're going to walk through this unstable, uncomfortable ground, the place where existential emptiness lives. Because maybe it's exactly there that meaning, paradoxically, starts to appear. There are moments when the whole world seems to lose its shine. It's not sadness, it's not fear, it's not exactly loneliness. It's like everything that used to make sense, your routines, goals, and plans, suddenly feels empty, as if life keeps going, but something essential is missing. This uncomfortable, almost metaphysical feeling is more common than we think. And it's exactly what led Martin Heidegger to one of the most intriguing ideas in 20th century philosophy. Nothingness isn't outside human life. It's at the center of it. Heidegger gives us a radical view of existence. For him, the human being isn't just another living creature. We're beings who realize that we exist, and that puts us in a unique position in the universe. This being, which he calls Dasein, being there, is the one who can question its own being, who lives aware of time, of death, and, above all, of the possibility that nothing has a fixed meaning. Heidegger says that Dasein is a being thrown into the world. That means we don't choose to be here. We simply find ourselves existing. We're thrown into a reality, into a time, into a body, into a culture. And from there, we're forced to build meaning. But, and here comes the crucial philosophical twist, there is no instruction manual, no fixed essence, no universal purpose telling us how to live. Everything is open. That does give us freedom, yes, but it also exposes us to what Heidegger calls angst, existential anxiety. In everyday life, everything seems to fit. We know how to act, how to talk, what to expect. But angst breaks that structure. Suddenly, what was familiar becomes strange. The ground of reality shakes, and what's left? Nothing. Heidegger describes angst as an experience in which the whole world becomes meaningless, not because the world disappears, but because it loses the automatic meaning we normally give it. It's as if, for a moment, we see reality without the filters of routine, distractions, and emotional numbing. And what we see, in this raw state of existence, is the abyss. But what is nothing for Heidegger? Different from how we usually think about it, nothingness isn't just the absence of something. For Heidegger, nothingness is part of the very condition of experience. He writes, "Nothingness is not simply the opposite of beings, but belongs essentially to the being of Dasein." Being and time, para 44. This means nothingness is not on the other side of life. It's built into life. It's inside the very structure of our being, and it shows up most strongly when all the ready-made meanings collapse. That's why angst isn't a defect of human life. It's a doorway, a state of expanded awareness where the human being realizes they are alone in front of the freedom to exist, and the lack of any final why. Paradoxically, it's in the emptiness that we run into the deepest possibility of existence. Being reveals itself in nothingness. When all certainties fall, when social roles disintegrate, when distractions stop, what's left is the raw fact that we are here. And that is as terrifying as it is liberating. Angst, instead of being something to avoid, is for Heidegger an authentic experience. It allows us to step out of automatic living and face the human condition head-on. It's when we stop living as if we were eternal and start realizing that our existence is finite, unfinished, unstable. In this same context, Heidegger introduces another key concept: being toward death. For him, death is not just the biological end of life. It is, from the start, a possibility that shapes who we are. We live toward death. It's the ultimate horizon of all our possibilities. And it's exactly because we are mortal that we have to choose and take responsibility for how we live. When Dasein recognizes death as part of itself, it understands there are no guarantees. No meaning is given beforehand. Every life is a gamble, but that same lack of fixed meaning opens the space for authenticity. Nothingness, far from being only despair, is also the condition for the freedom to create yourself. It's important to see that, for Heidegger, most people run away from this experience. They run from nothingness. They run from angst. How? By living in what he calls inauthenticity. That happens when we let society, conventions, and other people decide the meaning of our lives. It's the mode of they. You live how they live, work how they work, marry how they marry, consume what they consume. Dasein dissolves into the crowd, loses its individuality, avoids looking into the abyss, and settles for a shallow, everyday life. But at some point, angst comes back, because nothingness is always lurking. And when it shows up, it can be a chance to rebuild a more authentic life. The most powerful thing in Heidegger's philosophy is that nothingness is not a sentence to despair. It's an invitation to responsibility. Angst reveals that we are alone, but free, that there is no ready-made meaning, but that we can create meaning through our actions, choices, commitments, and projects. He's not saying we need to be existential heroes all the time. Angst is not something you go out looking for, but when it appears, and it always appears, you can use it as a moment of radical clarity, as a break in the noise of the world that lets you hear something more essential, the silent question of existence. What does it mean to be? Heidegger offers us a philosophy that isn't floating in the clouds. It grows out of real life. Nothingness, for him, is not an obstacle, but the invisible ground on which everything else is built. And when we have the courage to face it, without masks, without illusions, maybe that's when we finally start to exist in a more whole, genuine way. There's a moment when a question shows up, quiet, but relentless. Is it really worth going on living? It doesn't arrive with drama. Most of the time it appears in the middle of everyday life, between one task and another, or in that brief moment when the world slows down and silence finally catches up with us. And it's exactly in this breaking point between the automatic flow of life and the awareness of the absurd that Albert Camus steps in, one of the most striking existential thinkers of the 20th century. Unlike other philosophers who try to answer the pain of existing with religious or transcendent solutions, Camus suggests something both brave and unsettling. Don't deny the absurd. Don't run away from it. Face it with dignity. He calls this revolt. To understand what Camus means by revolt, we first need to understand the absurd. In the myth of Sisyphus, he defines the absurd as the clash between the human search for meaning and the incomprehensible silence of the universe. Human beings crave explanations, purposes, ultimate reasons, but the world stays silent. There are no ready-made answers, no guarantees. There's no cosmic script written for each life. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. The myth of Sisyphus. But if there's no given meaning, what do we do? This is where many thinkers fall into two temptations: despair, which leads to nihilism or a kind of existential suicide, or a leap into transcendence, appealing to God, an ideology, or some metaphysical system to fill the void. Camus rejects both. In The Rebel, 1951, Camus fully develops his answer. The rebel is the person who recognizes the absurd but refuses to accept it as a final sentence. He doesn't try to erase it, because that would mean erasing his own freedom. But he also doesn't surrender to it. He stands up against the absurd, knowing he will never win. To revolt is to say yes and no at the same time. To revolt is to affirm a value, even in despair. The rebel. Revolt, for Camus, is not blind rebellion or random violence like history has seen so many times. It's first of all an ethical and existential attitude, the stance of someone who, even in the face of an indifferent universe, chooses to affirm human dignity. There's a hard kind of beauty in Camus's proposal. He doesn't offer us promises of redemption. He doesn't say everything will get better or that the pain of existing will disappear. What he offers is something much closer to the ground, the courage to live fully, even without an ultimate why. To live in revolt is to live lucidly. It's to refuse comforting illusions and at the same time refuse the kind of despair that paralyzes. It's a kind of ongoing rebellion, quiet, personal, conscious. Camus finds in the figure of Sisyphus the perfect myth to express his philosophy. Condemned by the gods to push a stone up a mountain over and over, only to watch it roll back down every time, Sisyphus could give in to pure despair. But Camus says, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because Sisyphus claims his condition, owns his burden, and takes his absurd task as something that belongs to him. By not giving in internally, he turns his punishment into a strange kind of freedom. In the same way, the rebel embraces his absurd existence and even without hope of a final meaning, finds greatness in resisting. Camus's idea of revolt is not individualistic. On the contrary, it is naturally tied to others. Anyone who revolts against the injustice of the world, against suffering, against absurdity, is also saying, this is not acceptable for me or for anyone else. Rebellion in man is the refusal to be treated as an object and to be reduced to mere history. To revolt is to unite people, the rebel. Camus sees revolt as a shared ethical ground. It's not about creating rigid systems or totalitarian ideologies, but about recognizing, in our common human experience of suffering, a line of dignity that must not be crossed. So revolt doesn't destroy for the sake of destruction. It draws limits. It's what stops us from justifying murder in the name of an idea, from turning freedom into tyranny, or from accepting someone else's pain as a necessary evil. To live in revolt doesn't mean being at war with everything. It means being awake, aware, and fully present in what you do. It's refusing indifference. It's not numbing yourself with distractions, consumption, ideologies, or empty routines. It's looking into the void without flinching, and still choosing to plant a flower there. Camus is not saying life is easy. He knows it's hard, unfair, and often absurd. But for him, to live is to insist on affirming life anyway, without illusions, with courage. As he writes, the point is not to cure, but to learn to live with one's ailments, the rebel. Camus saw in art, friendship, solidarity, and freedom the fruits of this lucid revolt. Those who accept the human condition without masks and still choose to live become capable of creating beauty. Not in spite of the absurd, but precisely because they're aware of it. Lucidity, then, is not a burden. It's a strength. It doesn't promise easy happiness, but it offers something rarer, the nobility of existing fully, without running away from yourself. One of Camus's central warnings in The Rebel is about those who, in the name of revolt, end up creating totalitarian systems. He shows how political and philosophical revolutions, like the French Revolution, certain forms of Marxism, or radical nihilism, tried to impose an absolute meaning on the world and ended up justifying murder and oppression. Camus exposes this corruption of revolt. True revolt, he says, never denies the value of human life. On the contrary, it's born precisely from the refusal to sacrifice human beings for ideas. In the end, Camus is inviting us to stay loyal to our own humanity. We are not gods. We don't have absolute truths. But we're also not objects drifting around. We're conscious beings, capable of saying no to injustice, meaningless suffering, and the absurd, and at the same time saying yes to the beauty of life, to solidarity, to freedom. To revolt, for him, is an act of love for life, a refusal to let it become something mechanical, empty, or dehumanized. Camus doesn't offer comfort, but he offers something far more precious, an ethics of the real, a way of existing with courage even when everything feels empty. Revolt is not the end. It's the beginning of a life lived with lucidity, dignity, and presence. There's something unsettling about the silence that comes right after you finally get what you always wanted. What used to be a dream, a goal, an obsession. Once it happens, it doesn't bring the peace it promised. There's a brief rush of joy, and then the emptiness. This cycle of desire and frustration, so human, so ordinary, is at the center of the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the darkest and, at the same time, most brutally honest thinkers in Western philosophy. In his masterpiece, The World as Will and Representation, 1818, Schopenhauer gives us a raw and radical view of existence. Life is suffering. And what's behind this suffering? A blind, impersonal, relentless force, the will. Schopenhauer starts from one core idea. What we perceive as reality is not the world as it is in itself, but the world as it appears to us. In other words, a representation. Everything we see, touch, feel, and desire is filtered through our mind. But behind this world of appearances, there's something deeper, a metaphysical force he calls will. This will is not rational or conscious. It has no moral purpose, no divine meaning. It's a blind force that simply wants. It desires, pushes, drives everything, from the movement of celestial bodies to the most intimate impulses of the human being. The world is my representation, he writes, but also, the world is will. The world as will and representation, paragraph 1 and 19. Life for Schopenhauer isn't driven by reason, but by this irrational, never-ending energy that lives in everything. And that's why suffering is unavoidable. The basic condition of the human being, according to Schopenhauer, is desire, and to desire is to suffer. Why? Because while we're wanting something, we feel lack, anxiety, incompleteness. If we get what we want, the pleasure is short-lived, and soon a new desire appears. And if we don't get it, we're frustrated, dissatisfied, restless. In other words, we're always in debt to life. All life is essentially suffering. Schopenhauer isn't being pessimistic just for the sake of it. He's looking at how experience actually works and saying, there's a pattern here. And that pattern is the repetition of wanting, suffering, brief satisfaction, wanting again. But there's something even deeper. Suffering doesn't just come from desires that aren't fulfilled. It also shows up, maybe even more cruelly, when we realize that fulfilling our desires still isn't enough. That's when existential emptiness shows up. Imagine someone who gets everything they always dreamed of: status, money, love, recognition. But when they finally have it all, they realize none of it truly completed them. That's the quiet tragedy of life for Schopenhauer. The will itself is insatiable, and its final outcome, if there is one, is nothing. Life swings like a pendulum backward and forward between pain and boredom. Pain comes from lack of satisfaction. Boredom comes when there's nothing left to desire, and the emptiness behind the will starts to show. From this analysis, Schopenhauer builds his most disturbing thesis. The will to live is a trap. We don't choose to desire. We don't choose to exist. From birth, we're taken over by this force that drives us and wears us out. The will to live never lets us rest. It's in our instincts, our sexual impulses, our hunger, our ambition, our need for recognition. It's in everything, and it's never satisfied. So to live for Schopenhauer is to be trapped in a never-ending cycle of frustration. There is no real freedom while we're under the rule of the will. The emptiness, then, is not some glitch in the system. It's the hidden truth of our wanting. Is there a way out? The denial of the will. Given this bleak picture, You might expect Schopenhauer to defend suicide as a path to freedom, but surprisingly, he doesn't. For him, suicide is just another act of the will trying to escape itself, but still driven by the same inner force. True liberation, he says, lies in something much harder: the conscious denial of the will. The denial of the will is the only true salvation. Mass, the world as will and representation, paragraph 68. That means living in a way that reduces wanting, desires, impulses as much as possible. It's not about denying life itself, but denying the tyranny the will has over us. And where is that possible? Schopenhauer points to three main paths that allow a temporary or partial suspension of the will. Art. When we truly contemplate a great work of art, we disconnect for a moment from our personal desires. For a brief while, we stop wanting. We just contemplate. Music, especially, would be a pure expression of the will, and at the same time, a way to rise above it. Compassion. When we turn towards someone else's suffering, we feel empathy and step out of our own ego-driven will. An ethics of compassion, for Schopenhauer, is the only real morality, because it's born from recognizing the universality of suffering. Asceticism, inspired by Buddhism and Eastern mysticism, Schopenhauer sees in the ascetic the person who renounces pleasures and desires of the world, the one who truly manages to deny the will to live, not out of hatred for life, but out of a deep understanding of its tragic nature. Unlike much of Western thought, which often ties human fulfillment to winning, achieving, conquering, or progressing, Schopenhauer suggests that true wisdom lies in letting go. For him, the highest human ideal would be someone who reaches a kind of deep serenity, born from quietly stepping out of the constant struggle to want more. That's where the idea of the will to nothing appears. When we finally understand that to desire is to suffer, and that the promised meaning never really arrives, we begin to desire not to desire anymore. The will turns against itself, and what appears is silence, peace, emptiness, not as a lack, but as freedom. You might ask, in a time so obsessed with productivity, pleasure, success, and self-help, why should we still listen to Schopenhauer? Because he reminds us of something essential. Not every feeling of emptiness is an illness. Not every desire is freedom. In a society that constantly feeds our hunger for more consumption, more pleasure, more validation, maybe wisdom is exactly this: to look inward and ask, what am I really chasing? And if the honest answer is nothing, that doesn't have to be a problem. It might actually be the beginning of clarity. Schopenhauer doesn't offer us hope in the usual sense, but he offers something rarer: radical clarity about the nature of human suffering and the possibility of facing it with lucidity, compassion, and inner silence. Imagine for a moment that everything that defines you, your name, job, appearance, beliefs, even your life story, was, deep down, the result of ongoing choices and not some fixed essence. What would be left? What would really make you you? For Jean-Paul Sartre, the most famous of the French existentialists, this question is the starting point for one of the most radical ideas in modern philosophy. The human being is an emptiness that chooses itself, and it's exactly this emptiness that makes us free, painfully free. Sartre wrote his masterpiece, Being and Nothingness, in 1943, in the middle of World War II. It was a time of moral collapse, ideological conflict, and visible and invisible ruins. In that context, he threw out one of the most provocative lines in contemporary philosophy: man is condemned to be free. Being and Nothingness, Introduction. Condemned? Yes. Because for Sartre, we don't have a choice about choosing. We don't have a ready-made essence, a fixed nature, or a divine plan that tells us who we are. We are freedom in raw form. And even though that sounds like a gift, it's also a heavy burden. To explain this, Sartre talks about two basic ways of being. Being in itself, être en soi. This is the being of things. Rocks, trees, objects. They just are, closed in on themselves. They don't question themselves. They don't change from within. They're complete, but inert. Being for itself, être pour soi. This is the way human consciousness exists. Being for itself is not given and not fixed. It's always under construction, always projecting itself into the future, always questioning what it is. And what stands between being and being for itself? Nothing. Human consciousness, according to Sartre, is a break in being. It's the power to step back, to say no, to put distance between ourselves and what we are. This emptiness, this lack of being, is exactly what makes us free to choose. The existential emptiness Sartre describes is not a black hole that paralyzes us, but an open space for possibilities. You're not an engineer. You're being an engineer. You're not a shy person. You're acting shy, but you could act differently. You're not sentenced by your past. You are the author of what you do with what was done to you. This emptiness at the core of who we are, the fact that we are not essentially anything, is what gives us the freedom to become anything. But there's a high price for this freedom: total responsibility. No excuses, radical responsibility for existence. If there's no God to tell us what's right or wrong, if there's no fixed human essence, if there's no predetermined destiny, then every choice we make helps shape the world, and we are fully responsible for it. That's why Sartre insists man is responsible for what he is, being and nothingness. There's no way out. Every time we try to justify our actions with circumstances, social pressure, my upbringing, or that's just how I am, we're, in his view, acting in bad faith, mauvaise foi. Bad faith is the lie we tell ourselves to avoid the weight of our freedom. It's pretending we're something fixed and unchangeable, just so we don't have to face the emptiness that forces us to choose. And this radical freedom doesn't come without pain. It's tied to a feeling many people try to escape: anguish. Unlike fear, which has a concrete cause, anguish is the feeling of realizing that everything is in your hands and no choice comes with guarantees. Anguish is the recognition of the total responsibility of man for his own existence, being and nothingness. Feeling anguish for Sartre is a sign that you're awake to your own freedom. It's not a sickness. It's a brutal awareness of your autonomy. Contrary to what many think, Sartre doesn't celebrate freedom as something light and playful, like do whatever you want. On the contrary, freedom is crushing, because it demands that we create by ourselves the meaning of our lives, with no guarantees, no shortcuts, no script. If nothing is written, everything depends on us. And that's why existential emptiness, far from being just a lack, is actually the structural condition of freedom. Existence before essence. We are a project for Sartre. The human being is a project. We are not, like things, a finished reality. We are what we make of ourselves, moment by moment. Existence precedes essence. Existentialism is a humanism. In other words, first we exist, then we decide what we are. And this doesn't happen just once. It's an ongoing task. With every choice, every sacrifice, every action, we're defining ourselves. But there's another key piece in Sartre's philosophy: other people. When someone looks at us, we stop being pure freedom. We become an object being judged. This is what he calls the look of the other. That look hurts because it turns us into a thing, a fixed image. At the same time, it shows that we live in constant tension between being free and being seen. Freedom, then, is not something we live alone. It's a battlefield between our autonomy and other people's expectations. Emptiness as the space of freedom. Sartre doesn't deny emptiness. He takes it as his starting point. He's not saying life comes with a built-in meaning. He's saying we can, and must, create it. There is no universal script, but there are personal projects, chosen values, and commitments we decide to take on. The meaning of life is not found, it's built. To live authentically is to accept this emptiness as the raw material of freedom. It's to say, nothing is written, but I'm writing. In a famous talk, Sartre defends existentialism as a philosophy of responsibility. If everything depends on us, then every act is a choice, not just for me, but symbolically for humanity as a whole. Every gesture affirms a value. If I act like a coward, I'm saying cowardice is an acceptable way to be. If I act with courage, I'm saying a human being can be courageous. In choosing for myself, I choose for mankind. Existentialism is a humanism. And the emptiness, does it still scare you? Yes, existential emptiness will always be a challenge. But for Sartre, it's not a hole to run away from. It's the open space of freedom. No fixed human nature. Even better, we can become many things. No destiny. Even better, we're free to create our own path. No God. Then we're the ones responsible for inventing values. That's the call of existential freedom, to accept the emptiness and fill it with choices. We live in an age where almost everything is within reach. Instant information, material comfort, freedom of choice. And yet, maybe more than ever, so many people feel lost, empty, disconnected from themselves. Not because there are no options, but because there's no sense of meaning. That contradiction is at the heart of Viktor Frankl's thinking. Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist and a survivor of Nazi concentration camps. In his most famous book, Man's Search for Meaning, 1946, he goes beyond traditional psychology and touches something deeply human. The human need to find a reason to live. For Frankl, suffering is not what destroys a person. What destroys is suffering without knowing why. It's facing pain, routine, loneliness, or even success without any real what for. Frankl calls this the existential vacuum, a kind of inner emptiness that actually widens in more developed societies. The existential vacuum is a widespread phenomenon of the 20th century. Man's search for meaning. But how is that possible? How can we live in a time of so much technological progress and still feel such a widespread lack of purpose? Frankl's answer is clear. With the collapse of traditional values, like religion, stable morality, community, and shared rituals, modern people found themselves free but disoriented. No reference points, no transcendence, no center of meaning. And in the face of that, three typical reactions appear. Conformism, living the way everyone else lives without thinking. Fanaticism, clinging blindly to some ideology, movement, or belief. Emptiness, sinking into boredom, discouragement, anxiety, or compulsions, overwork, consumption, addictions. Frankl criticizes the reductionist view of psychology in his time, especially Freud and Adler. Freud said human beings are driven by the search for pleasure. Adler said the main drive is the will to power. Frankl proposes something deeper. Human beings are driven, above all, by the search for meaning. Man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life. Man's search for meaning. And it's not some generic, universal meaning. It's something personal, unique, something each person has to discover for themselves. There is no manual, no ready-made formula. The meaning of life isn't given. It's discovered. Frankl doesn't see the existential vacuum as a disease, but as a symptom of human freedom. With the modern freedom to do almost anything comes the weight of having to choose something that truly matters, and that's where many people break down. He writes, "Man has freedom to change his destiny, but this freedom may cause him to doubt what to do." Man's search for meaning. That doubt often turns into chronic anxiety, a feeling of being lost, lives with no clear direction, even when everything looks fine on the outside. Facing this crisis, Frankl develops logotherapy, a therapeutic approach centered on discovering the meaning of life. Logos in Greek means meaning, so logotherapy is literally therapy through meaning. Different from approaches that mostly look to the patient's past, like psychoanalysis, logotherapy invites the person to look toward the future. What is still possible for you to do? Who do you matter to? What makes it worth enduring this pain? Frankl bases his ideas on an extreme, and for that reason deeply legitimate, experience. He survived Auschwitz and other Nazi death camps. He lost his wife, his parents, and his brother. He lived through the darkest side of humanity. And even there, he saw that those who had a why could endure almost any how. The one thing you can't take away from me is the way I choose to respond to what you do to me. Man's search for meaning. He saw prisoners who, even starving and humiliated, shared their last piece of bread. Others who held on just for the hope of seeing a child again, writing a book, or bearing witness to something important. What kept them alive wasn't physical strength. It was meaning. Frankl says there are three main ways a person can find meaning, even in suffering. By doing a work or accomplishing a task, creating something, doing meaningful work, bringing something into the world. By experiencing love through deep connection with another human being, recognizing their dignity. By the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. When we can't change the situation, we can still change how we face it. Suffering, in this case, becomes an ethical challenge. This third path is what makes Frankl's philosophy so powerful. He doesn't romanticize pain, but he says that when suffering is unavoidable, it can be turned into something meaningful. In Frankl's view, the human being is, essentially, a responding being. The word responsibility is central in his work. It's not about guilt, it's about the ability to respond to life, even when life doesn't make sense. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. Man's search for meaning. So the question isn't just, what is the meaning of life, but rather, what meaning is life asking me to find right now? What is this moment asking of me? That shift in perspective, from waiting for life to give us something, to offering something to life, is the heart of logotherapy. In today's world, we've often replaced the search for meaning with empty distractions, constant entertainment, shallow content, consumerism, work with no real purpose. Frankl sees this as an existential risk. The more we run away from the inner emptiness, the more it grows. That's why so many people who seem successful on the outside live in deep dissatisfaction. The human soul, Frankl reminds us, doesn't live on pleasure and comfort alone. It needs meaning. Unlike Sartre, who saw freedom as a kind of condemnation, Frankl sees it as an ethical calling. We are free, and that's huge. But that freedom isn't there so we can just do whatever. It's there so we can respond to life with integrity, even in suffering. He says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Man's search for meaning. In a world full of easy answers, shallow self-help, instant success promises, quick-fix therapies, Frankl invites us to something much deeper. To face the emptiness directly and fill it with purpose. It's not about denying suffering or looking for a ready-made meaning. It's about living each day as a chance to respond with courage and dignity to the life that's in front of us. There's a kind of silence that's frightening. Not the silence outside, but the one that shows up inside us when we suddenly realize we're free. Free to choose, free to act, but also free to mess up, to fail, to get lost. That kind of freedom, instead of feeling light, feels heavy. It's like standing at the edge of a cliff. No one is pushing you, but you're fully aware that you could jump. This moment of existential vertigo is exactly what Søren Kierkegaard, often called the father of existentialism, calls anxiety. And he goes further. This anxiety is not a problem to be eliminated. It is actually the birth of self-awareness. It's in this emptiness, in this confrontation with the possibility of nothingness, that the self wakes up. One of Kierkegaard's deepest contributions in the concept of anxiety, 1844, is the difference he draws between fear and anxiety. Fear has an object. We're afraid of something specific, an illness, an accident, losing someone. Anxiety, on the other hand, has no face. It's the feeling of infinite possibility. It's the discomfort of realizing you could become anything. And because of that, you feel like you're standing on nothing. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, the concept of anxiety. That line sums up the existential paradox Kierkegaard wants to show us. Freedom, far from being simple, puts us face to face with the void, and that inevitably produces anxiety. To explain this, Kierkegaard turns to the biblical story of Adam and Eve. Before eating the forbidden fruit, Adam didn't know good and evil. He lived in a state of innocence, a being not yet fully aware of himself. But something in him changes even before he disobeys. He feels anxiety. This anxiety, Kierkegaard says, is not caused by guilt because sin hasn't happened yet. It's caused by the realization that he could choose. God's command awakens in Adam the possibility of breaking the rule, and along with that comes the dizziness of freedom. Anxiety is the presentiment of the possible, the concept of anxiety. And here's the central point. Freedom is the possibility of good, but also of evil. It's the possibility of being, changing, creating, but also of failing, destroying, and losing yourself. What sets human beings apart from other creatures, for Kierkegaard, is exactly this awareness of possibility. Trees, animals, stones. They live according to their nature. But the human being lives in a relationship with themselves. We are not just what we are. We are what we can become. This relationship with oneself is what Kierkegaard calls the self. But this self is not given to us as a ready-made gift. It's a task. The self is a relation which relates itself to itself, a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of possibility and necessity. The sickness unto death. And where does this synthesis start to take shape? In anxiety, because it's in anxiety that a person realizes their possibility of being free and the weight of having to become who they are. Kierkegaard does not see anxiety as a mental illness. On the contrary, it's a silent teacher. Through anxiety, we leave behind a naive way of living and start to live more authentically. It forces us to become aware of our freedom, our choices, and our responsibility for our own existence. Anxiety is the reality of freedom as the possibility of possibility. The concept of anxiety. That sounds abstract, but think of it like this. You're standing in front of several doors. None of them are labeled. None of them are guaranteed to be safe. Choosing any of them requires a leap, and that leap creates anxiety. But if you run away from that anxiety, you're also running away from yourself. Not everyone can handle that dizziness. Many people try to escape anxiety by hiding in routines, rigid beliefs, distractions, or dependencies. But for Kierkegaard, if you run away from anxiety, you give up your freedom. You drop the task of becoming a true self, and instead live as a reflection of the world, a social role, a number in the crowd. The result of that is what he calls despair, not always a dramatic, visible despair, but a quiet one that shows up as a life without authenticity. Given this, Kierkegaard suggests what he calls the leap of faith. But be careful, it's not about blind faith or shallow religiosity. It's a leap because there are no guarantees. It's an inner move where a person accepts the paradox of being free, of being both finite and infinite, of carrying anxiety and still choosing with courage. This leap doesn't erase the emptiness, it transforms it. It doesn't give us certainties, but it gives us a chance to live more deeply. Kierkegaard is deeply concerned with the ethics of existence. For him, living well is not just following external rules, but fully taking responsibility for yourself. And that's why anxiety is so central. It keeps us from living on autopilot. It forces us to stop, think, choose, and live with the consequences. Living ethically, then, is not just doing the right thing. It's living consciously, deliberately, and committed to your own freedom. Even writing in the 19th century, Kierkegaard anticipated our modern struggles with surprising accuracy. We live in a world with almost endless options: careers, lifestyles, relationships, ideas. But that flood of possibilities doesn't completely free us. It also paralyzes us, because the more we can choose, the more we worry about choosing wrong. So what do many of us do? We run. We bury ourselves in digital distractions. We settle into pre-made patterns. We live as if life were already decided. But Kierkegaard calls us back to the center of anxiety, not to suffer, but to wake up. Deep down, all his philosophy is a kind of appeal: become who you are. But that won't happen without pain, doubt, and vertigo. Anxiety is the beginning of that journey. It's the sign that you're finally standing in front of yourself, and that the time for living on autopilot is over. Anxiety, then, is not an obstacle, but the condition of authentic freedom. It pushes us inward, to the core of our responsibility. And only there, in the quiet of nothingness, can we start to say yes to the freedom to be. There's a kind of pain that doesn't come out as tears. It doesn't scream, doesn't explode, doesn't fade with time. It settles at the bottom of the soul as a constant silence, a feeling of being emptied out, as if something essential has been lost forever. That pain has a name: melancholy. In Mourning and Melancholia, 1917, Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, makes a crucial distinction. Not all sadness is the same. There is mourning, which is a natural reaction to loss. Painful, yes, but something that tends to heal over time. And there is melancholy, which doesn't follow that path. It doesn't close. It gets stuck inside the person, creating a lasting emptiness, an invisible wound that changes the structure of the self. Freud starts by recognizing that suffering is an unavoidable part of mental life. Losing someone we love, or something we deeply value, hurts, and that hurt shows up as mourning. In mourning, the world feels poorer. Everything loses some of its color. But even while walking through that shadow, the person still keeps the ability to love, to desire, to recognize themselves as whole. In mourning, respect for reality eventually wins over the attachment to what was lost. Mourning and melancholia. Mourning, as painful as it is a healthy process. It's an inner work, the work of mourning, that allows a person to slowly let go of the lost object and redirect their energy to other parts of life. It has an end. It's hard, but eventually it can be worked through. In melancholy, though, something goes wrong in that process. The person doesn't just suffer because they lost something. They suffer because they can't clearly recognize what they lost. And even worse, they start to identify with the loss itself. In melancholia, the shadow of the object falls upon the ego. Mourning and melancholia. That's one of Freud's most powerful and mysterious phrases. It means that instead of working through the loss, the person swallows it. They unconsciously take the lost object into themselves. But when they do that, the pain of losing the other turns into pain about themselves. The love that used to be directed outward becomes self-criticism, diffuse guilt, and self-hatred. In melancholy, it's not the world that feels empty. It's the self that feels worthless, drained, and meaningless. I don't know what I lost. Freud points out that many times the melancholic person can't name what they lost. And that's key for understanding why melancholy is so paralyzing. It might not be a concrete loss like death. It can be a symbolic loss. The end of a relationship, the collapse of an ideal, the shattering of an illusion, a deep disappointment with oneself. Because there isn't a clearly recognized loss, the work of mourning never really starts. The suffering hangs in time, feeding a shapeless emptiness. In mourning, the pain is aimed at the outside world. The other is gone. In melancholy, the attack turns inward. I am the problem. The person becomes their own executioner. They quietly blame themselves. They feel guilty for not being enough, for failing, for losing something that often wasn't even in their control. This harsh self-criticism doesn't come from logic. It's driven by a psychic pain rooted in the unconscious relationship with the lost object. That's why in melancholy it's common to see deep apathy, a sense of worthlessness, inability to feel pleasure, anhedonia, a distorted self-image, self-destructive thoughts. What sets melancholy apart from other forms of emotional pain is that persistent inner emptiness. It's not just sadness, it's the feeling that something essential in the self is missing. It's like the person hasn't just lost the other, but also a part of themselves, as if the loss had eaten away at the core of their identity. Freud notices that this state can drag on indefinitely, and worse, it can become almost impossible to heal if the person can't bring into awareness what was lost and why they blame themselves so much for it. True to his view of the unconscious, Freud sees melancholy as the result of a hidden inner conflict. Something was deeply loved, and then, for some reason, also came to be hated. That mix of love and resentment can't be fully admitted consciously. So the mind takes a shortcut. Instead of directing hate at the other, the person turns it against themselves. That's how melancholy is born, as disguised self-aggression fueled by unconscious guilt. What Freud described over a century ago still feels disturbingly current. We live in a time of deep symbolic emptiness, shallow relationships, superficial connections, losses that aren't treated as real losses, almost no rituals of mourning. A lot of people today show melancholic symptoms without knowing what they lost. It might be identity, ideals, bonds, life projects, but without words to name these losses, they turn into diffuse existential emptiness that slowly makes the person sick inside. And not understanding what they feel, they turn against themselves. For Freud, finding a way out of melancholy means bringing the lost object into consciousness, recognizing the mixed feelings around it, and finally doing the mourning that never happened. That's hard. It takes time, listening, and the courage to face the unconscious, something he tried to reach through analysis. But Freud also suggests something powerful between the lines. When we manage to put into words what we lost, it stops eating us from the inside. It becomes memory, experience, a part of our story, and no longer just a black hole silently consuming us. It's important to be clear. Melancholy is not drama, and it's not a character flaw. It is often an unconscious way of surviving a pain that felt impossible to face fully. By recognizing this, Freud gives us a deeper and more compassionate way of looking at those who suffer in silence. He invites us to listen not just to what someone says, but also to what they can't say, because that's often where the emptiness hides. Melancholy, the way Freud describes it, is a kind of frozen mourning, a grief that was never expressed, a love that was never understood, a self that never managed to forgive itself. Above all, it's a silent scream. And like every scream from the unconscious, it needs to be translated, heard, and held. Freud doesn't offer easy fixes, but he does give us a key. When we name what we lost, we give shape back to the emptiness. And maybe, from there, we can begin not to forget, but to rebuild something inside us where before there was only absence. At some point in life, the awareness of death gets closer, not as an abstract idea, but as a real presence. It shows up in a diagnosis, in a near-miss accident, in the loss of someone close to us, or simply in a quiet moment when everything suddenly feels way too fragile. In those moments, we realize something we spend most of our time avoiding. We are going to die, and that realization changes everything. For the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, this isn't just any truth, it's the horizon of existence. Only when we look death in the face and fully own our finiteness do we become truly authentic. That's one of the central ideas of his work Being and Time, 1927, where Heidegger presents death not just as an ending, but as a key to understanding what it means to be human. Heidegger starts his philosophical project with a seemingly simple question: what does it mean to be? But to answer that, he has to look at the kind of being that can even ask that question. In other words, the human being. He calls this being Dasein, in German, literally being there. Dasein is the being thrown into the world, the one that relates to things, builds meaning. But above all, it's the being that is aware of its own existence, and therefore also of its own death. Heidegger says death is not just a biological event that happens at the end of life. It is, first of all, a constant possibility. Life can end at any moment, and most importantly, no one can die in my place. Death is the most own, non-transferable, and unsurpassable possibility of Dasein, being and time, para 50. That dense sentence carries a deep existential truth. Most own, only I can die my own death. Non-transferable, no one can live it for me. Unsurpassable, it's the limit that can't be gone beyond. For Heidegger, death is not just something that happens at the end. It structures our whole existence. Because Dasein is a being that understands itself through time, it is capable of anticipating death. This doesn't mean obsessing over dying, but seeing clearly that life is finite. That anticipation brings us face to face with nothingness, with the fact that everything we are, do, or build can one day cease to exist. But paradoxically, it's exactly this confrontation with nothingness that reveals being. Heidegger argues that anticipating death pulls us out of the shallowness of everyday life. It makes us see that time is limited, that our choices matter, that we don't have time to live in an inauthentic way. Most people, according to Heidegger, live in an inauthentic way. They live according to what people do, what people expect, what everyone says. He calls this the existence of the they, das Man in German. Examples of this way of living are everywhere. You work to be successful. You get married, have kids, and retire. You think this way because everyone thinks this way. In this mode, Dasein loses itself in the world, lives by external standards, avoids facing its own freedom and finiteness. It lives as if it were eternal. But anticipating death breaks that pattern. It shows us there's no time to waste on superficiality. It calls us back to the center of our existence. Heidegger says, Dasein should take on the attitude of being toward death. This means living with the awareness of finitude as an essential part of life. It doesn't mean living in fear. It means living with existential urgency. Understanding that each choice is unique, that life isn't a rehearsal, that every moment is a chance to actually be who you are. Being toward death discloses the possibility of an authentic existence. To live as being toward death is to refuse to keep postponing life. It's to reject a numbed, half-awake existence. It's to say yes to the responsibility of living fully, because death doesn't allow reruns. One of Heidegger's most moving ideas is that awareness of death makes us more human. It brings us closer to the truth that we are vulnerable, fragile, temporary. And at the same time, it gives us the power to choose what to do with the time we have. This awareness makes life precious, not because it's long, but because it's one of a kind. In Being and Time, Heidegger shows that human existence is essentially temporal. We're not beings that just are. We are beings that become over time. And time isn't infinite. Every day, we move closer to our death. And that limit gives weight to our freedom. What are you doing with your time? Are you actually choosing, or just going with the flow? Are you living for yourself, or just copying what's expected? These are the questions that being toward death throws at us. Questions that can't be postponed. In today's culture, death is often pushed aside. We avoid talking about it, thinking about it, or facing it honestly. It gets pushed into hospitals, funeral homes, and distant news stories. But Heidegger reminds us, the more we hide death, the more we lose the chance to live authentically. When we pretend we're eternal, we live distracted, disconnected, and shallow lives. His call is the exact opposite. Look death in the eye, and from there, live deeply. Heidegger believes that by anticipating death, Dasein takes ownership of its existence. It stops being just a reflection of others and becomes the author of its own story. This ownership doesn't mean total control or perfection. It means accepting the risk of choosing consciously, living responsibly, and embracing finiteness as part of our being. Authenticity, then, isn't a goal you reach once and for all. It's a way of being, a constant effort to live up to your own existence. In Heidegger's thought, death is not just the end of life. It's the starting point for understanding being itself. It wakes us up. It shakes us. It brings us back to what really matters. When we understand that we're mortal, we see that life is made of choices that can't be endlessly delayed. And that leads us to the most fundamental question: am I living in a way that's true to who I really am? Heidegger doesn't want us to live afraid of death, but to live with death as a horizon. Just like the horizon guides a traveler, without ever being reached, death guides our existence. It shapes time. It gives urgency to life. It turns freedom into an ethical call. In the end, Heidegger suggests something that sounds paradoxical. The only way to live fully is to remember that we're going to die. That memory isn't meant to paralyze us, but to set us free. It invites us to get out of the surface level, to drop the rush, the noise, the masks, and finally to become who we are. There is a kind of emptiness that isn't just the absence of things, but the absence of relationship. It's not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of not being seen. It's not ordinary loneliness, just being without company, but something deeper, more radical. It's the loneliness of being itself, the feeling of being irredeemably separate from everything and everyone, even in the middle of a crowd. That's the starting point for Emmanuel Levinas, a 20th century French philosopher who offers one of the most original and ethical interpretations of existential emptiness. The emptiness we feel is not just an inner hole, it's the cry of the self for the presence of the other. And this emptiness, according to him, can only be answered by alterity, by an ethical relationship with another human being. In Totality and Infinity, 1961, Levinas goes beyond the usual existentialist view that treats loneliness as a psychological or emotional condition. For him, loneliness is ontological. In other words, it belongs to the very structure of being human. The self, when it turns inward, discovers something uncomfortable. No matter how much it dives into its own interior, it is never enough for itself. Self-awareness, no matter how intense it is not enough to give existence meaning. The self is closed in on itself, trapped in its own identity, separated. Totality and infinity. This separation is not the result of a choice, and not some defect to be fixed. It's the starting point. The human being, as a thinking being, is a separated being, wrapped up in its own subjectivity. And it's exactly there that the longing for transcendence is born, a longing for something beyond oneself. For Levinas, existential emptiness is not just the absence of meaning, but a hunger for encounter. It's not only about wanting to understand life, but about wanting to be recognized by another who always escapes me. This is where he flips the direction of philosophy. While many thinkers try to fill existential emptiness with self-knowledge, authenticity, or personal projects, Levinas says, the meaning of the self comes from the outside. The self only understands itself when it is called by the other. Levinas uses a striking image for this: the face of the other. The face, for him, is not just a physical appearance, but a presence that challenges me, that knocks me off balance. When I look another person in the eyes, not as an object, but as a unique, unrepeatable being, something happens. I feel called to respond. I feel responsible. The face of the other is the epiphany of the infinite. I'm totality and infinity. That phrase, mysterious and powerful, reveals the core of Levinas's thought. The infinite, what we've always tried to find in religion, philosophy, or art, is not up in the heavens, but in the face of another human being, in the vulnerability of the one who suffers, who asks, who confronts us with their radical otherness. Levinas breaks with a long philosophical tradition when he says that ethics comes before ontology. In other words, before we ask what being is, we should ask how we relate to the other. That's crucial. For him, existence only starts to truly mean something when the self responds to the other. Even before I think, act, or choose, I am already a being exposed to the face of the other. And that exposure makes me responsible. Emptiness, then, is not a lack of inner content, but a lack of ethical relation. It's the echo of a call that has not yet been answered. The title Totality and Infinity already signals a central tension in Levinas's philosophy. Totality represents systems that try to absorb everything into one logic, one identity, one whole. It's what happens when we try to reduce the other to what we already know. When, instead of listening, we label. Instead of welcoming, we interpret everything according to our own schemes. Levinas criticizes this tendency of Western reason to dominate the other through knowledge. For him, a true encounter only happens when we let the other be other, when we recognize that the other slips out of our grasp, that they are more than any definition we can put on them. The other is absolutely other, totality and infinity. And it's in this radical otherness that the meaning of existence begins to appear. One of the most challenging aspects of Levinas's ethics is that it doesn't depend on reciprocity. When I see the face of the other, I become responsible, even if the other doesn't give anything back, even if they don't recognize me. Ethical responsibility is not a contract. It's a response that arises from the vulnerability of the other and hits me at the deepest level. That completely changes how we think about relationships. I'm not with the other to get something, to complete myself, or to fix my emptiness. I am with the other because they call me to be more than just myself. Levinas offers an existential answer to today's emptiness. It's not success, consumption, or self-knowledge that will fill us. It's ethical hospitality. Hospitality not just in the social sense, but in an ontological sense, making room inside yourself for the other to exist. Recognizing that the other person's life matters more than your comfort, more than your certainties, more than your own ego. This hospitality doesn't erase ontological loneliness, but it turns emptiness into openness. Instead of feeling needy, the self starts to feel responsible. And in that responsibility, it finds a new kind of meaning. Levinas's thought runs against a lot of modern philosophies centered on the individual. While Sartre, for example, talks about freedom as a solitary project of the self, Levinas says, meaning doesn't begin in me. It is given to me by the other. And it's in that inversion that his philosophy becomes radically ethical. I am not the center of the universe. I am someone who is called, provoked, summoned by an other who forces me to step outside myself. This stepping out, this exodus of the self, is the antidote to emptiness. We live in an age marked by indifference. People are connected technologically, but disconnected humanly. Existential emptiness is filled with stimuli, but not with real relationship. Levinas is an urgent voice for our time. He reminds us that the other is not an obstacle, not a tool, but the very foundation of my existence. In the age of individualism, he calls us to responsibility. In the age of loneliness, he offers the ethics of encounter. In the age of consumption, he offers the dignity of the face. In the end, the ontological loneliness Levinas describes is not a destiny, but a starting point. It's the moment when the self realizes it's not enough on its own, that it needs the other, not to be romantically completed, but to respond ethically. Emptiness is not healed with certainties or techniques. It's answered with relationship, with listening, with taking responsibility for the other who suffers. And by responding to the other, the self may finally discover, without even looking for it directly, the meaning it's been searching for all along. There's something that moves us, that pushes us to search, to want, to desire. But the strange thing is, even when we finally get what we really wanted, desire is never fully satisfied. A new desire soon appears, and the chase starts all over again. It's like something is always missing. That experience is the starting point of Jacques Lacan's thinking, one of the most enigmatic and influential psychoanalysts of the 20th century. By rereading Freud through the lens of structural linguistics, Lacan offers a bold view of subjectivity. The human being is not a stable, conscious I, but a divided subject, marked by a fundamental lack, whose desire is never fully its own. Lacan's famous phrase, "Desire is the desire of the other," reveals an unsettling truth. We don't just desire the object itself, we desire the place we occupy in the other person's desire. For Lacan, the human subject is not born as a complete being. From the very beginning, it is crossed by a structural lack, a symbolic emptiness that defines it. This lack is not an accident. It's not caused by a specific loss, like losing an object, a person, or an opportunity. It's there even before any particular experience, because it's built into how the subject comes into being in language and culture. The subject is what is missing in the signifier. Lacan écrit. In other words, the subject is not the master of itself. It is formed by a network of signifiers, words, symbols, discourses, that shape and constitute it, but never capture it completely. This impossibility of saying oneself fully, of being totally represented, is what creates the lack. And it's around this lack that desire is organized. We usually think of desire as lack in a simple way, desire for something we don't have. But Lacan proposes something more complex. Desire is not just wanting what's missing. It's the way the subject positions itself in relation to its own incompleteness. This incompleteness is unavoidable because no object will ever fill it completely. Even when we get what we want, love, success, achievement, desire keeps going, because the object was never exactly what we were really desiring. Desire is always desire for something else. Seminar Inth. The structure of desire is infinite. It can't be cured, fixed, or satisfied once and for all. To desire is part of being human. It's what drives us, and at the same time, what we lack. One of Lacan's most quoted lines is, "Desire is the desire of the other." But what does that mean? First, Lacan writes other with a capital O. This other is not just another person. It's the symbolic place of culture, language, and law, the field where the subject is written in and written by. From very early on, the subject learns to desire through the desire of the other. It desires to be loved by the other. It desires to be recognized by the other. It desires what the other desires. A child, for example, doesn't really know what it wants. It organizes itself around what it feels the mother wants from it. It's out of this first relationship with the desire of the other that desire takes shape. And this goes on throughout life. Our desires are always marked by an outside gaze, by someone else's expectations, by the symbolic place we occupy in other people's discourse. This has deep consequences. The subject never desires alone. Desire is always mediated, always crossed by the other. That means we never fully know what we want. And even when we think we do, a big part of our desire is an unconscious response to someone else's desire. That's why many people spend their whole lives chasing goals that deep down aren't really theirs. They're internalized desires. The parent's desire, the social desire, the desire of the culture, the desire to be desired. This kind of alienation is unavoidable. And that's why Lacan says the subject is an effect of language, not some independent inner essence. For Lacan, what we truly desire is never fully accessible. He gives a name to this lost object, Object A, the famous objet petit a, the object cause of desire. Object A is not a real concrete object. It's what is always missing, what was lost in the very process of the subject being formed. It's what seems to be behind everything we want, but never shows up directly. So every object of desire in life, a lover, a possession, a social status, is an attempt to recover this object, A, and always fails. And it's exactly that failure that keeps desire alive. Another key concept in Lacan's theory is jouissance, usually translated as enjoyment or drive satisfaction. But it goes beyond simple pleasure. Jouissance is the point where pleasure becomes too much, excessive, uncomfortable, even painful. As it desires, the subject seeks jouissance, but also fears it, because it reminds the subject of its own lack, its own fragility. There is always a limit that desire can't cross without destroying itself. Lacan shows that desire is a never-ending attempt to return to some original fullness, but that this is impossible. There is no going back to oneness. The subject is born out of loss, and that loss is what defines it. Even with all this talk of lack, Lacan is not a philosopher of despair. On the contrary, it's precisely because there is lack that there is desire, and therefore movement, creation, transformation. Desire is not something to be eliminated, but something to be owned as the engine of our existence. When the subject recognizes that it will never be complete, that its truth escapes itself, that its desire will never be fully satisfied, it stops waiting for an impossible fullness and starts desiring with responsibility. In psychoanalytic practice, Lacan invites the analyst to listen not just to what the patient says, but to what desire is saying through them. The subject's speech is full of gaps, slips, repetitions, and it's in those gaps, in those cracks in language, that the unconscious shows itself. Because the unconscious, for Lacan, is structured like a language, but a language that doesn't know it's speaking. The analyst's job is not to fill the subject's lack, but to help the subject reclaim their desire, to take responsibility for it, even knowing it will never be completely clear or complete. Recognizing lack and desire is not just a theoretical move, it's an ethical one. It's accepting that there are no guarantees, no pure desire, no fixed identity. It's also recognizing that the other's desire runs through me, but that how I respond to it is my responsibility. The subject is not the one who desires whatever it wants. The subject is the one who takes responsibility for the desire that lives inside them. And in that ongoing work of listening, opening up, and reworking desire, maybe we can learn to live inside the emptiness without denying it, and turn it into a space for creation, not just a space of lack. There's a kind of inner silence that doesn't bring peace, but restlessness. A free moment that doesn't relax you, but makes you uneasy. It's when the world slows down, the noise fades, and you find yourself alone. No tasks, no distractions, no God. That moment, which many call boredom, is for Blaise Pascal one of the most revealing symptoms of the human condition. In his famous book Pensée, 1670, Pascal, mathematician, physicist, and deep religious thinker, dives into the depths of the human soul to diagnose a disturbing truth. Boredom is more than simple annoyance. It exposes the existential emptiness we carry when we live far from the absolute. Pascal sees boredom as a kind of spiritual misery dressed up as something normal, and he shows that faced with this emptiness, we don't choose courage, we choose distraction. Pascal writes, "All of humanity's problems stem from one single thing, not knowing how to stay quietly in a room." This simple but powerful line sums up one of his sharpest insights. We can't stand being alone with ourselves, because when there's nowhere left to run, we're forced to face the biggest absence of all, the absence of meaning. And it's in that confrontation that boredom appears, not just as nothing to do, but as the discomfort that comes when we sense there's no ultimate meaning to life without God. Pascal is paradoxical. He sees boredom as a sign of human greatness. After all, we're the only beings who get bored. Animals live by instinct. Objects exist without knowing it. But human beings can think, question, and reach for the infinite. And because of that, we also suffer when we don't find meaning. Man infinitely surpasses man. But that greatness comes with matching misery. If we long for the infinite but live in the finite, we live in constant frustration. And instead of facing that frustration, we choose to distract ourselves. Pascal is one of the first thinkers to notice that human beings don't mainly run away from pain. They run away from boredom, because pain still has a cause, a reason. But in boredom, there's nothing, and nothing is more frightening than pain. That's why we create what Pascal calls divertissement, distractions. Not fun in the light modern sense, but mechanisms to avoid facing our inner emptiness. Divertissement keeps us from thinking about ourselves. These distractions can take many forms: empty entertainment, obsession with work, frenetic pursuit of pleasure, ambition with no real purpose, superficial conversation, mechanical social rituals. All of this works like a psychological detour, a way to dodge the question we fear the most. What is all this for? As a Christian thinker, Pascal believes this inner emptiness is not a psychological defect, but a metaphysical one: the absence of God. There is in the heart of man a God-shaped void. This famous line clearly states Pascal's central claim. No matter how much we chase earthly fulfillment, the human being will never be fully satisfied by it. Everything finite, possessions, status, pleasure, success, eventually reveals itself to be not enough. Existential emptiness, then, is the echo of the missing infinite. And boredom is the symptom of that absence we refuse to acknowledge. Even writing in the 17th century, Pascal anticipated our modern condition with striking precision. Surrounded by stimuli, but unable to really listen to ourselves. Surrounded by achievements, but haunted by a sense of emptiness. Exhausted by speed, but not knowing why we're running technology, consumerism, hyperconnectivity. All of this can be seen as new forms of divertissement. And Pascal would warn us, the more sophisticated the distraction, the harder it becomes to notice the emptiness it's hiding. When everything finally goes quiet, when the distractions fade, when the noise stops, we come face to face with an abyss, our own existence with no guarantees. Pascal describes this encounter as a kind of vertigo. The eternal silence of these infinite spaces terrifies me. Pensée, paragraph 206. That poetic and frightening line shows that boredom is not something light. It's the feeling of someone who realizes the universe doesn't answer our questions, that the world doesn't, by itself, offer meaning. This cosmic terror, this chill that comes from the abyss, is what Pascal sees as the condition of a human being without faith. For Pascal, man hangs between two extremes, the misery of nothingness and the glory of God. Only by recognizing his smallness and his need for the transcendent can he find peace. But Pascal doesn't ask for blind faith. His famous wager is actually an attempt to show, in rational terms, that it's better to bet on God's existence than to live as if nothing matters. Still, more than proving God, Pascal wants to reveal the human condition. A being who, left to himself, gets lost in boredom, distractions, and emptiness, but who, when open to the absolute, finds rest. Strangely, Pascal also suggests that boredom can be an opportunity, a chance to stop, to listen, to admit that emptiness won't be filled with more activity, but with meaning. In that sense, boredom is a kind of inner calling, a silent cry of the soul saying, "There is more than this." But to hear that cry, we need courage. Courage to be quiet. Courage to be alone with ourselves. Courage to face the emptiness without rushing to fill it right away. Today, we live in a real epidemic of disguised boredom. We call it anxiety, procrastination, fatigue, apathy. But deep down, we're dealing with the same anguish Pascal described. A being made for the infinite, lost in the finite. The difference is that in the 17th century, boredom was seen as a spiritual problem. Today, we treat it as a disorder to medicate, a defect to fix. But maybe we should listen to it more seriously, like Pascal did. Pascal confronts us with an uncomfortable truth. We don't just run away from boredom, we run away from ourselves. And we run away from ourselves because we're afraid of the emptiness inside. That inner space only the absolute could fill. But if we have the courage to stop, to be silent, and to see boredom as a symptom instead of an enemy, we might discover something new. That emptiness is not the end. It's the beginning of a more honest search. We live connected through screens, surrounded by information, pushed by routines and constant busyness, but, paradoxically, more isolated than ever. It's not just physical isolation, but existential, a growing distance between the individual and the world around them. It's as if we're all online, but without any real common ground where we actually meet. This feeling of rootlessness and emptiness is central to the work of Hannah Arendt, a 20th century German philosopher who in her book The Human Condition, 1958, offers a sharp and radical reading of modernity. Our real existential emptiness doesn't come from the isolated self, but from the breakdown of the shared world between people. For Arendt, the crisis of meaning is not just psychological or spiritual, it's political and ontological. And at its root is the loss of the common world. What is the common world? Unlike many existentialist thinkers who focus on inner individual experience, Arendt believes that a human being can only truly become who they are in relation to the world and to others. The common world is not just the planet or the physical space we live in. It's the symbolic, political, cultural, and social space where human experiences gain meaning. The world, as the space between people, arises in action and speech, the human condition. It's in this common world that we share stories, debate ideas, build institutions, create collective memories, recognize one another as human beings. Losing this world, or making it irrelevant, means falling into alienation. Not alienation from work, like in Marx, but alienation from meaning, from language, from shared reality, labor, work, and action. To understand how we got here, Arendt makes a famous distinction between three basic human activities. Labor. This is what we do to stay alive: eating, sleeping, caring for the body. It's cyclical, repetitive, and tied to biological survival. Work. This is what produces objects and transforms the world, building houses, creating tools, producing goods. It creates some permanence because it leaves behind tangible results, action. This is what happens between people in the public space, taking initiative, starting something new, speaking, making decisions together. It's through action and speech that we reveal who we are to others as unique individuals. For Arendt, it's in action and public speech that we truly become human. And it's exactly this dimension that is in crisis in modern times. With the rise of technology, bureaucracy, and mass society, action has been reduced more and more to technical performance. The modern individual is no longer someone who acts, but someone who produces, consumes, and fits into an impersonal system. Arendt warns that because of this, the public space stops being a place of encounter, debate, and shared meaning, and turns into an empty stage filled with scripted speeches, propaganda, and performance. The disappearance of the public realm makes people live as though they were alone, even when they are together. The human condition. The result is what she calls the collapse of worldliness. The world, instead of bringing us together, stops feeling meaningful. We become spectators of a reality that no longer feels like it belongs to us. When the shared world collapses, Arendt notices that when we no longer participate in the world actively, we stop recognizing it as real. That may sound strange, but it has a clear logic. What isn't shared, argued about, and seen by others starts to lose its sense of reality. It's in meeting others and recognizing each other that something gains weight and significance. So modern existential emptiness is not just something inside us. It's the expression of a world that has become opaque, a reality that is no longer built together, but broken into bubbles, filtered by algorithms, driven by individual consumption and solitary experiences. When the common world collapses, the consequences are deep. Words lose their value because no one is really listening. Action loses power because there's no space where it matters. Identity becomes hollow because there's no one to share it with. The modern subject then swings between cynicism. Everything is fake, nothing matters. And apathy. Nothing is worth doing. There's no point participating. Boredom, alienation, and emptiness become almost normal ways of living. Rebuilding the common world. But Arendt is not a philosopher of despair. On the contrary, she believes in the power of human action to rebuild the common world. For her, politics is not just about power struggles, but about creating a space where human plurality can appear, where different people can show up without having to erase each other. Plurality is the law of the earth, the human condition. And that means recovering practices that are being lost, truly listening, dialoguing with those who are different, having the courage to start something new, taking responsibility for making the world livable for everyone. Rebuilding the common world is not just a political project in the partisan sense. It's first of all an ontological and ethical choice. It's choosing, in the face of emptiness, not to close in on yourself, but to open up to others. It's refusing extreme individualism that suffocates the public space. It's accepting that meaning is not built alone. It's created together. The world only exists as long as there are people who speak, act, listen, and respond. Why Arendt speaks so strongly to today? Arendt's thinking feels more relevant than ever. We live in an age of fake news and disinformation, where reality dissolves into competing versions. Public debate is polarized, hostile, or emptied of real listening. Social media connects us, but often leaves us more isolated. Politics turns into a show or pure management, not a space for human action and mutual revelation. In this scenario, existential emptiness grows because the world stops being a place where we truly meet. Arendt calls us to resist this trend, to rebuild the world, not as something out there, but as the shared space where we recognize each other as human. For her, the greatest threat to humanity is not violence or lies. It's inner desertification. The desert is the world without a world. It's the loss of meaningful language, real listening, and plural action. Against this desert, she proposes a return to action. But not just any action. Action rooted in plurality, dialogue, and commitment to the world. We don't need lone heroes. We need people willing to rebuild, brick by brick, the common world. For Hannah Arendt, the loss of the common world is not an inevitable destiny. It's a warning. The existential emptiness we feel is not proof that life has no meaning. It's a sign that the space where meaning is built is in ruins. And rebuilding that space takes more than individual will. It takes community, action, presence, speech, and the courage to be in the world with others. There are moments when every word feels empty. When the intellect goes quiet, images lose their sharpness, and our desires don't seem to have any strength left. It's an inner silence that isn't depression and isn't boredom. It's a sacred emptying, as if something inside us were being prepared for a deeper encounter. This moment is what negative Christian mysticism describes as the experience of nothingness. For Meister Eckhart, a German theologian and mystic from the 13th century, this nothing is not a dead, sterile void, but the fertile ground where God can finally dwell. Eckhart's spirituality revolves around a radical and deeply transformative idea. To find God, you have to let go of the self. And to let go of the self, you have to pass through inner emptiness, Gelassenheit, letting go, detachment, total surrender. Who was Meister Eckhart? Meister Eckhart, c. 1260–1328, was a Dominican friar, philosopher, and theologian who centuries before modern language about psychology, subjectivity, or nihilism was already talking about the need to quiet the ego in order to reach what he called the ground of the soul, where God can reveal himself. Even though he was deeply rooted in Christianity, Eckhart goes beyond common devotional language. His approach is contemplative, philosophical, and often paradoxical. He speaks of God as nothing, of a spirituality without images, and of a path that goes through the complete renunciation of the I. He was criticized by some and revered by others. But his thought is still, today, one of the deepest sources of what we call negative mysticism. For what is negative mysticism? Negative mysticism, or the via negativa, is a spiritual tradition that says God is unspeakable, unnameable, inconceivable. We can't reach him through reason, imagination, or desire. Everything we think or say about God is insufficient, because God is not one being among others, but the very source of being. That's why the path of negative mysticism is not about piling up knowledge, but about letting go of everything. Ideas, images, words, concepts, desires, attachments, and in the end, the self itself. Eckhart writes, "In order for God to enter, we must be completely empty. God only enters where everything is empty." The German word Gelassenheit is central in Eckhart. It can be translated as letting go, serenity, detachment, letting be, or even a kind of sacred indifference, but it goes beyond all of those. It's the inner attitude of giving yourself completely, without demanding, without expecting, without trying to control. It's active renunciation, a spiritual act of letting go of your own will, not out of passivity, but to allow God to be in us. We must let God be God in us. German sermons. This radical surrender is not a sign of weakness. It's the highest expression of spiritual freedom, freeing yourself from yourself in order to find what is greater than yourself. The I as obstacle. In Eckhart's view, the biggest obstacle between the soul and God is the I. This I is not just your surface identity. It's that inner center of control, the ego will, the self-image that constantly tries to assert, conquer, dominate. As long as a person holds on to their own will, they cannot experience true peace. Sermon 2. That's why he insists, the I has to die, spiritually. It's not about destroying the human being, but about going beyond the ego, allowing the center of the soul to no longer be the self, but God. This death of the self is painful, but it's also freeing. It's like letting go of everything we think we are, so we can become what God already sees in us, the nothing as sacred space. For modern spirituality, talking about nothing can sound hopeless. We live in a culture that fears emptiness and associates it with lack of meaning, loss, or death. But for Eckhart, nothingness is not absence, it's space. It's the open field where God can appear without being limited by our images and expectations. He says, "The more you are empty of yourself, the more you are filled with God." This inner nothing is not a denial of life. It's a denial of the false self, the inner noise, the illusion of control. In this nothingness, there is no noise, and that's why it's the place where the voice can finally be heard. Eckhart says that God is not far away, somewhere in an unreachable heaven. God is in the depth of the soul, but that depth only reveals itself when everything else is silenced. There is something in the soul that is untouched by time and flesh, something that belongs only to God. This something is the ground of the soul, the purest spiritual core, where union with God is possible. But this ground is often covered over by our agitation, our desires, our judgments, our ideas. That's why the path is one of inner dispossession. And it's on this path that the experience of nothingness becomes the path to fullness, seeking God by not seeking to possess him. Meister Eckhart goes against the usual logic of spiritual seeking. He says that the more we try to seek God as an object, the less we find him. Because God is not something we can own, he simply is. So he writes, "Whoever seeks God seeking something does not seek God." True union happens when we stop seeking in that possessive way, not out of apathy, but out of total surrender. When we become empty vessels, not demanding, not wanting, just open. It's in this surrender, Gelassenheit, that the divine can act in us without resistance. Not escaping the world, but living freely in it. Even with all his focus on letting go, Eckhart is not preaching an escape from the world. He doesn't want us to run away from life, but to live it without attachment, with inner freedom. He says we can be at peace even in the middle of busyness, as long as the heart is detached and surrendered to God. We must be free of ourselves in all things and in the midst of all things. This is the heart of active mysticism, living fully in the world, but not being captured by it, acting with compassion, but without ego, speaking truth, but not chasing approval, doing good, but without needing to control the outcome. Why Eckhart speaks to our time. We live in an age of excess, too many stimuli, too many wants, too much information, too many identities, and at the same time, a growing feeling of emptiness. Meister Eckhart offers us a paradox. Real emptiness is not what makes us poorer. It's what sets us free. Inner nothingness is not a lack of being, but the presence of a space where being with a capital B can finally live. His message is incredibly current. In an anxious age, he offers silence. In a culture obsessed with ego, he invites us to let go of the self. In a society chasing non-stop, he says, "Let go, and you will find." The experience of nothingness, in Eckhart's mysticism, is not the end of the road. It's the beginning of listening. It's in the deepest silence that the word can echo. It's in letting go of the self that the mystery can show itself. It's in detachment that the most authentic spiritual freedom is born. This is the wisdom of nothingness, not to destroy us, but to open us to what is beyond us. A void that doesn't separate, but unites. A silence that doesn't erase, but welcomes. In the modern world, the word emptiness usually sounds like something negative. We think of emptiness as absence, loneliness, lack, anguish, a hole that needs to be filled. But not every tradition sees emptiness as something to fight against. For Lao Tzu, a Chinese thinker from the 6th century BCE, and author of the enigmatic Tao Te Ching, emptiness is not a deficiency. It's a creative power. 30 spokes share the hub of a wheel, but it's the empty space in the middle that makes it useful. In this view, emptiness is not an obstacle, but the condition for things to arise. It's not the absence of life, but the space where life can flow more freely. What Western philosophy often connects with despair, Taoist philosophy understands as path, balance, and the fertile ground of being. The central concept in Lao Tzu's work is the Tao, a word that means way, but whose meaning is much broader and deeper. The Tao is the invisible, unnameable source of everything that exists. It is the original principle, the cosmic flow that runs through all things, not as a personal deity, but as the natural order of the universe. In the first verse of the Tao Te Ching, we already find the warning. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. In other words, the Tao goes beyond all definitions and fixed forms. Trying to capture it in words is the same as losing it. Even so, we can live in harmony with it, and that's what Lao Tzu is trying to teach. The Tao, even though invisible, is generative. Lao Tzu says the Tao is like a cosmic womb. It receives everything, allows everything, gives life to everything. The Tao is empty, yet in use it is inexhaustible. This emptiness is not inertia, but pure potential. It is a fertile emptiness, the space where anything can happen. Just as silence makes music possible, and the space between words gives meaning to a text, the emptiness of the Tao allows all forms to arise, grow, and return. Unlike many Western traditions that link emptiness to anguish, nihilism, or lack of meaning, Lao Tzu celebrates emptiness as a condition for inner freedom and harmony with the flow of life. When a human being tries too hard to control everything, fill everything, and fix everything, they move away from the Tao. But when they empty themselves, when they let go of the rigidity of the ego, they become like the Tao, fluid, present, calm. Stillness is the pattern of the Tao. Emptiness is the dwelling of the sage. Here, emptiness is not a bottomless pit. It is open space. It is non-resistance. It is non-forced action, which allows true being to come through. This principle unfolds into the idea of Wu Wei, one of the most important notions in Taoism. Literally translated as non-action, Wu Wei doesn't mean passivity, but acting in a natural way, without artificial effort, without pushing against the natural course of things. The Taoist sage is not the one who conquers the world by force, but the one who acts in tune with the natural movement of the Tao. And to do that, they need to empty themselves of ego-driven intentions, compulsive desires, and excessive thinking. The sage is empty, like a valley. He receives everything, and because of that, nothing can overwhelm him. This emptied state is what makes him open to the fullness of being. And here lies the great paradox. It is by emptying himself that the human being becomes full. Lao Tzu often compares the sage to a valley, the lowest place, but also the most receptive. While what is high is rigid and isolated, the valley receives the waters of all rivers. The greatness of the valley is in its ability to receive. That is why it remains full. Tao Te Ching. This metaphor points to a kind of wisdom that the modern world often rejects. The wisdom of not needing to win all the time. The wisdom of yielding, listening, and adapting to the flow of things. The wisdom of being empty of yourself so you can be available to the whole. In this sense, emptiness is not weakness. It is the quiet strength of total presence. For Lao Tzu, human suffering is born from excess ambition, excess control, excess ego, excess desire. While the Tao moves in silence and fluidity, the restless person tries to impose their will on the world and ends up frustrated. Because the more they try to fill themselves with things, the further they get from the simplicity of being. Those who are full of themselves will be emptied. Those who empty themselves will be filled. This is the paradoxical wisdom of the Tao. Only those who accept emptiness can live fullness. Lao Tzu's philosophy is an invitation to a lighter, quieter way of living, more in tune with the rhythms of nature. And that's only possible through letting go of the ego, opening inwardly, and welcoming emptiness as a space of creation. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. Tao Te Ching. In silence, truth blossoms. In emptiness, being shows itself. In non-forced action, real action happens. This is the way of the Tao. Not putting yourself at the center, but letting the center be occupied by what is greater than you. If there's an image that sums up the essence of the Tao, it's water, liquid, adaptable, soft, but also powerful, persistent, and patient. Water overcomes what is hard and strong because it does not resist. The sage is like this, and so is the human being who lives in tune with the Tao. Does not fight against the world, but flows with it. Does not try to control everything, but follows the natural course of things. Does not impose their presence, but gently fills the spaces with wisdom and calm. And for that, you need to be empty like water, without a fixed shape, yet able to transform everything. Lao Tzu teaches that emptiness is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived consciously. It is the womb of the universe, the space from which everything is born and to which everything returns. It is the pause between sounds, the silence that makes listening possible, the stillness that comes before blossoming. In a time when excess is suffocating us, too many stimuli, too many words, too many desires, too many self-assertions, Lao Tzu's thought feels like a deep breath, a reminder that wisdom lives in simplicity, humility, stillness, and, above all, in the ability to empty ourselves so that life can happen. There are moments when the world, which once felt familiar, suddenly reveals itself as strange, almost absurd. A park bench, a rock, a tree, everything, out of nowhere, seems to have too much existence. It's as if reality itself, for a second, shows its naked face, without veils, without meanings we've projected onto it, raw and unsettling. That's the experience lived by Antoine Roquentin, the main character in the novel Nausea, published by Jean-Paul Sartre in 1938. It's not just a story, it's philosophy told through literature. And in it, Sartre doesn't just describe the life of a lonely man in a fictional town. He exposes the abyss of existing, the discomfort of being, and the existential emptiness that appears when every illusion of a given meaning collapses. But what is nausea, after all? In the novel, Roquentin starts to feel a strange and growing sensation, a kind of unease with no visible cause. It's not a physical illness. It's an unbearable awareness of the world as it really is, with no justification, no purpose, no metaphysical structure holding it up. Existence had suddenly revealed itself. Jean-Paul Sartre, Nausea. Everything that once felt natural, objects, people, routines, now appears as something radically contingent with no reason to be. Things simply exist. And this excess of being, this absurd presence of the world, causes vertigo, not because something is wrong, but because there is nothing behind it. With this novel, Sartre launches a new philosophical sensitivity. While tradition kept looking for foundations, essences, first causes, Sartre pushes it to the limit. Being simply is. Being is in itself. It is what it is. Being and nothingness. And this being in itself, as he will later call it, doesn't need any justification. It wasn't created by a divine will, nor sustained by some hidden purpose. Being has no why. That lack of foundation is what produces nausea. Roquentin realizes that nothing justifies the existence of a tree root, of his own hand, or even of his being. Everything is absurd in the most radical way, because there is no reason for anything to be the way it is. Another devastating effect of nausea is realizing that all human categories, tree, bench, person, love, work, are just mental constructions we use to organize a chaotic world. Roquentin looks at a chestnut tree root and suddenly sees that it's not really a root. It simply exists, in a grotesque, excessive, inexplicable way. The root existed in front of me, in all its naked horror. Nausea, paraphrased. This experience invites us to question how often we live leaning on words and concepts that cover up the brutality of being. When the world is stripped of language and categories, it becomes strange, and we, ourselves, become strangers to ourselves. But nausea isn't limited to external things. Roquentin discovers that he is not necessary either. There is no essence that defines him, no deep self waiting to be found. He is just a being thrown into the world, condemned to exist, with no excuses, no preset direction, no inner nature guiding him. This realization is violent, because it rips away the illusion of identity, and at the same time, it leaves us totally free and totally responsible. Sartre will later write, "Man is condemned to be free, being and nothingness." Nausea is, paradoxically, an experience of revelation. It destroys illusions, yes, But in doing so, it reveals the truth of the human condition. There is no essence determining us. We are free to create what we are. That freedom may sound like a gift, but it's also a burden. Because if we don't have a predefined nature, we're forced to choose at every moment what we want to be. And there are no guarantees, no formulas. Every choice defines who we are and makes us fully responsible. This is the core of existentialism. Existence precedes essence. In other words, first we exist, and only afterwards do we build what we are. It's this setup of radical freedom, without a roadmap, that produces the existential unease Roquentin feels. Sartre is not interested in comforting anyone. He wants to expose, in all its harshness, what happens when a human being stops lying to himself about God, about an absolute morality, about some pre-established meaning. Nausea is, in that sense, a philosophical and spiritual experience, a sort of dark night of the soul for the modern world, where nothing remains except being, and that is already too much. Sartre's use of fiction is not decorative. He wants to show that philosophy is not just an abstract exercise, it's something you live, feel, and embody in everyday life. Roquentin is a philosopher without calling himself one. His body, his feelings, his loneliness, all of it becomes the vehicle for a metaphysical revelation. And the novel shows that the philosophy of being isn't just in books, it's in streets, cafes, park benches. That's one of the most important legacies of Nausea. It makes philosophy visceral, concrete, and disturbing. Still, Sartre doesn't end in pure despair. Nausea, while deeply unsettling, is also a door to authenticity. When he realizes that nothing has meaning by itself, Roquentin glimpses a possibility to create meaning, to choose his path, to take on his freedom as an act of creation. He thinks of writing a novel, a symbolic gesture of creating out of the void something that could justify his own existence. That gesture marks the birth of existentialist ethics. We are not what the world does to us. We are what we do with what the world did to us. The experience described in Nausea still echoes loudly today. The feeling of strangeness, emptiness, loss of meaning hasn't disappeared. If anything, it has intensified in a world that is faster, more fragmented, hyper-connected, but often lacking any real existential grounding. Sartre's Nausea is the discomfort we feel when we realize that no system fully explains our freedom. Not traditional religion, not political ideologies, not consumer culture, not success. And that's where its strength lies. It doesn't offer cheap consolation. It offers clarity. Everything is gratuitous. This garden, this town, myself. When you understand that, that's Nausea. Sartre takes us to a limit point of consciousness, the moment when a human being looks at the world and finds nothing, and then realizes that this nothing is the starting point. The void, far from being just absence, becomes the space of freedom. And Nausea, bitter as it is the first taste of lucidity, the taste of someone who is finally starting to truly exist. Picture yourself walking through a modern city where everything seems within reach: entertainment, shopping, lifestyle choices, identity, options, storefront lights, endless screens, the constant call to be yourself in feeds, malls, and parties. And yet, underneath all that bright surface, something quiet is eating away. It's the void. A void that doesn't scream, but you can feel it. In the emptiness behind the likes, in the flood of possibilities that don't really fill you, in the fact that you're always connected and still feel alone. This is the picture Gilles Lipovetsky paints in The Era of Emptiness. He argues that postmodernity didn't get rid of absurdity or make meaning obsolete. It changed the way we relate to it, and in many cases, it produced an emotional and ethical emptiness that follows the hypermodern individual everywhere. Lipovetsky says, the big modern shift was to free the individual from traditional ties, social classes, fixed roles, inherited values. This modern individual, the self-made man, became a project of himself. But in the postmodern era, that emancipation goes a step further. Radical individualism. It's no longer enough to be formally free. Now you have to be original, stylish, unique. The problem, Lipovetsky points out, is that this freedom plays out in a context where the big reference points, institutions, ideologies, collective values, are losing their weight. The result? We have more choices than ever, but less grounding. Everything can be reset, replaced, swapped out. Life turns into a kind of flow, identities that keep getting updated, relationships that dissolve, buying and throwing away instead of building things that last. The illusion of everything at your fingertips lives side by side with the feeling that nothing really holds. Lipovetsky says this situation produces two central phenomena. Narcissism. The self turns inward to show itself off, to affirm itself. Hedonism. The constant chase for pleasure, comfort, and stimulation. Both of these, instead of giving depth, end up hollowing it out. In today's world, being yourself easily turns into selling yourself, personal branding, your feed, your selfies. Meanwhile, the public space, where people debate, go deep, and commit to something long-term, feels like it's fading. As Lipovetsky says in an interview, we don't live in absolute emptiness, but in a kind of emptiness of references. They've multiplied and turned fluid, unstable. One of his key points is the fragmentation of values. The big systems that gave meaning in the modern era, institutional religion, strong political ideologies, tight-knit communities, lost their force. In their place, we get micro-meanings, causes à la carte, short-lived identities. Postmodern man tends to drift away from strong, structuring values and live in a culture of style, trends, and what's new. This scattering creates an ethical void because if everything is valid, every style, every lifestyle, every choice, then nothing feels that important. Big decisions lose weight. The collective future, the shared what for, gets weaker, and the individual is often left alone with the consequences of choices he had to invent by himself. That's the ethical emptiness Lipovetsky is talking about. He also calls attention to the weakening of the public sphere, the shared world where we argue about values and build a real we. He says there's a growing lack of interest in the public sphere. When the public world loses density, human relationships become more superficial, more utilitarian, more short-term. The result? People feel more isolated, more privatized, more thrown back on themselves. The existential emptiness shows up here, not only because there's less meaning given from the outside, but because there's less space to share meaning. The we falls apart, and what's left is the lone I. Another element Lipovetsky highlights is the culture of collective indifference. When everything can be tolerated, but nothing really demands anything from you, nothing deeply engages you, nothing truly moves you. He talks about a kind of pure indifference, an existential numbness where constant novelty ends up acting like an anesthetic. That indifference moves in sync with the logic of individual spotlight. The I wants to be seen, wants to be special, but deep down doesn't really connect. The paradox is brutal. You're visible, exposed, segmented, out there, and at the same time empty of deeper meaning. Lipovetsky also links postmodern individualism to emotional emptiness. He describes how the overload of stimuli, the chase for shallow experiences, the obsession with looking good and feeling good on the surface, end up generating inner loneliness. Instead of deep relationships, we get quick exchanges. Instead of continuity, we get instant moments. Instead of roots, we get constant mobility. The person living in the era of emptiness is free to reinvent himself, but also forced to reinvent himself. That freedom turns into a burden. Lots of choices, lots of decisions, very little collective support. Add to that a culture of consumption, of products, of bodies, of experiences that promises fulfillment, and usually delivers only temporary stimulation. The result: anxiety, restlessness, and a feeling of being existentially dehydrated. Lipovetsky emphasizes that postmodernity isn't necessarily dark or depressing. It's light, fluid, seductive. Well-being, pleasure, and self-expression are real, legitimate values, but he warns that lightness has a dark side: constant urgency, unstable certainties, the fear of being left behind. Lightness turns into weight when lack of meaning meets an overload of options. In this context, the void doesn't show up as a dramatic abyss. It shows up as a quiet undertone, that feeling of something's missing, without being able to say exactly what. That's the diffuse emptiness Lipovetsky captures so well. Possible ways out: finding meaning in the middle of the overload. Even though his diagnosis is sharp, Lipovetsky doesn't just sink into pessimism. He suggests there is a way to rebuild meaning, not by going back to rigid old structures, but by creating values that fit a complex modern world. Authenticity, responsibility, conscious engagement. Instead of letting ourselves be fully swallowed by the logic of me as a brand, he imagines us living in more collaborative relationships, in a revitalized public sphere, with an ethics less about speeches and more about practice, and in a life that doesn't give up modern freedom, but also recovers real existential depth. Why this matters right now: we're living in 2025, in an even more saturated world. Social media, algorithms, fast consumption, instant stimuli, lives on repeat. What Lipovetsky described back in 1983 feels amplified: digital narcissism, the attention economy, the short shelf life of experiences, and along with that, a sense of emptiness, more visible, more painful, more ordinary. It's important to see that this postmodern emptiness isn't just about cruelty or personal failure. It's built into the social structure. It comes from the mix of technology, economy, culture, and subjectivity. Understanding that helps us stop blaming only the individual and start thinking about how we, do or don't, build meaning together. In the era of emptiness, Gilles Lipovetsky invites us to look honestly at the effects of almost unlimited freedom, endless choices, self-worship, hedonism, and, right alongside them, the erosion of the symbolic support that institutions and shared values used to provide. The result is a kind of void that doesn't show up in headlines, but seeps into our inner life and our culture. Loneliness in the middle of crowds, superficiality in a life full of stimuli, freedom with no direction. But the diagnosis is not the last word. The real call is to live more consciously inside this age of plurality, and not let ourselves be swallowed by the void. Modern freedom has never been this big, and maybe because of that, it has never needed solid values this much. At a certain point in history, the ground shook under the feet of Western man. What had, for centuries, held up the meaning of life, morality, order, and truth started to quietly crack, until one man dared to say out loud what many were already sensing: God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. That's how Friedrich Nietzsche puts it in The Gay Science, 1882. This wasn't cheap blasphemy or a random attack on faith. It was a brutal diagnosis. The values that once organized the world had been hollowed out. God, as the symbol of the entire moral and metaphysical structure of Western culture, had stopped doing his job. And without that absolute reference point, what was left? Nietzsche saw, more clearly than most, the void. For Nietzsche, the death of God is not a theological event. It's a crisis of meaning, a civilizational turning point. It's not that God literally died, but that belief in him lost its strength. And with that, the structures that guaranteed what was right or wrong, good or evil, true or false, fell apart. People still went to church, still talked about values, still believed in progress. But deep down, they no longer believed with the same conviction. It was an empty faith, kept alive by inertia. And Nietzsche had the courage to name this. The death of God exposes a deeper problem. If there is no longer a supreme, universal, absolute value, then everything can be questioned. Is everything relative? Is everything just human invention? And if it is, who decides what counts and what doesn't? That's where nihilism is born. The feeling that nothing has intrinsic value, that everything is fragile, temporary, without any ultimate foundation. Nietzsche didn't invent nihilism. He diagnosed it, and more importantly, he didn't treat it as some scandal, but as a necessary stage in modern consciousness. Nihilism is the moment when we realize that the values we inherited no longer support us, but we haven't yet been able to create new ones. It's the point where everything seems to collapse and we still don't know what to put in its place. Nietzsche writes like someone watching a sick humanity, cynical, faithless, resentful, paralyzed, people who have lost their sense of purpose but keep pretending everything is fine. He knew this collapse wouldn't end peacefully. He knew that a culture that kills its God has to face the consequences, and those consequences would be deep, an ethical void, a collapse of identity, an existential abyss. Nietzsche warns about a danger that, faced with the void, people react with resentment, nostalgia, fear, that they try to restore old values by force, or that they give in to conformism, to passive nihilism. If nothing has meaning, who cares if I live or die? This is the figure of the reactive man, the one who doesn't create, just survives, repeats, adapts, goes along. He lives in the shadow of values he no longer truly believes in, or he sinks into a cold cynicism, incapable of any real passion. Nietzsche despises this posture. He doesn't want nihilism to destroy human beings. He wants it to purify them. In place of inherited morality, Nietzsche proposes something radical. Man needs to be overcome. Not in the sense of destroying human beings, but reinventing them. Out of the death of God, a new kind of being should be born. The Übermensch, the Overman, the one who creates values from within himself, who can affirm life even without transcendent guarantees, who says yes to existence, including suffering, uncertainty, and finitude. The Übermensch doesn't wait to be saved. He doesn't need absolutes. He lives as a creator, an author of meaning, someone who turns the chaos of the world into a field of possibility. He doesn't ask, "What is the meaning of life?" He answers, "What meaning do I want to give to life?" To test whether someone is ready for this new way of living, Nietzsche offers a challenge. What if you had to live this same life, with every pain, every mistake, every joy, over and over again, endlessly, for all eternity? That's the idea of eternal recurrence, not as a literal belief, but as a deep ethical test. Could you love life that much? Could you say yes to it without wanting to erase anything, without regret? If your answer is yes, you are close to the Übermensch. If your answer is no, you may still be carrying the weight of the old morality, guilt, fear, escape. Nietzsche proposes a radical kind of love, amor fati, love of fate, not wishing things were different, but embracing what is and creating from who you are and what you've lived. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy shines the most. He shows that nihilism is not the end of the road. It's the beginning of something new. You have to cross the desert of meaninglessness. You have to endure the silence of a world without guarantees. You have to face the loneliness of an existence with no dogmas. But if we're brave enough not to run away, not to numb ourselves, not to fall into cheap cynicism, then maybe, just maybe, we can start again from scratch, create like artists of our own life, and live intensely without having to lie to ourselves. More than a century later, the death of God still echoes. We live in a secular world, flooded with information, consumption, and choices. But how many people actually live with a sense of purpose? How many really create, affirm, and dare to say yes to who they are? Nietzsche still speaks to us. He still provokes. He still challenges. His message isn't comfortable. But it's not hopeless either. It might be one of the most honest messages of all. The world doesn't come with a ready-made meaning, but you can give meaning to it. Have you ever felt like nothing is really solid? That no matter how hard you try to hold on to certainties, identities, ideas, beliefs, desires, everything slips through your fingers as if it were made of fog? Nagarjuna didn't run away from that feeling. On the contrary, he pushed it to its final consequences and turned it into a doorway to freedom. At the heart of his philosophy is a concept that destroys any attachment to solidity: shunyata, emptiness. But this emptiness is not a denial of life. It isn't nihilism. It's a revelation. Nothing has its own fixed essence, and because of that, everything can change. Nagarjuna looks at the world with precision and compassion. He doesn't see the universe as a collection of things with fixed, sealed natures. He sees relationships, interdependence, processes in motion. Nothing at all, not an object, not a thought, not even the I that says I, exists in an isolated, independent, self-sufficient way. And that, for him, is liberating. Because if everything is conditioned, interconnected and impermanent, then everything is open to change. Nothing is locked into an eternal identity, not even you. Maybe the biggest prison we carry is the idea that we are this or that I am like this, I have this past, I need this to be happy. We carry a self the way you carry a heavy piece of furniture in a tiny room, taking up all the space, suffocating everything. Nagarjuna's proposal is radical. That self doesn't exist the way you think it does. It's an illusion built out of mental habits, language, memory, attachment. What actually exists is a flow, a process. And when you see that, there's a kind of deep sigh of relief, because you realize you don't have a rigid identity to defend. You have a life to live. Emptiness here is not loss, it's space. It's the fresh air that comes in when you let go of the need to be something fixed. A lot of people, when they hear emptiness, slide straight into nihilism. So nothing matters. So nothing exists. Then what's the point of living? Nagarjuna never defended that. He doesn't say nothing exists. He says things don't exist by themselves. They do exist, but in relation, in movement, without a self-contained essence. That lack of a fixed essence is exactly what makes them alive. Emptiness is not a black hole where everything disappears. It's an open field where anything can happen. It's the opposite of rigidity. It's pure potential. In Nagarjuna's thought, the world isn't a building on solid foundations. It's a dance. It's a web of relationships where everything depends on something else to arise, to remain, and to fade away. You are not an isolated self. Bureau. You're the result of causes and conditions. Your childhood, your relationships, your choices, your body, your language, your emotions. All of that forms something we call you, but it's never standing still. This I that tries so hard to stay fixed is a useful illusion, but a dangerous one. Useful because it helps you function. Dangerous because it makes you suffer when everything changes, and everything inevitably changes. Nagarjuna teaches, if we understand that there is no fixed essence, we can loosen our grip, and with that, suffer less. That has a deep ethical consequence, because if nothing is separate, if everything is interdependent, then you and the other person are not truly two completely separate worlds. We are all expressions of this living flow, this empty field that is full of connections. The other person's suffering affects me. My suffering ripples out into the world. Compassion stops being an abstract virtue and becomes a natural reaction. How could I not care if the other is also me in another form? Emptiness shows us that the boundary between me and the other is thinner than it looks. And compassion isn't just a moral choice, it's a consequence of how reality is. Nagarjuna also points to the limits of logical thinking. In his verses, he takes apart one by one the categories we use to say something is or is not, exists by itself, or exists through another. The conclusion is unsettling. None of these categories fully holds up. Thinking, in its hunt for security, creates dualisms, separations, rigid identities. But reality is more subtle than that. It slips away. The path of wisdom, then, is not to pile up certainties. It's to let go of them. It's to loosen our grip on concepts, to see through names, to recognize the silence behind language. That's where emptiness shows itself, not as denial, but as clarity. The word Nagarjuna uses, shunyata, is not an abyss. It's a window. It lets us look at life without the lenses of attachment, fear, and rigidity. It melts the "it has to be this way" and the "this is mine," and invites us to live more lightly. You are not a thing. You are a movement. The world is not a fixed stage. It's a current always in motion. Seeing this doesn't mean losing your footing. It means discovering that you don't need solid ground to dance. That's the beauty of it. He didn't want you to just believe that everything is empty. He wanted you to see for yourself, to look at reality, carefully take apart your illusions, and find the freedom that's already there in the middle of the flow. Emptiness is not just a theory, it's an experience. It's a shift in how we inhabit life, and it begins at the exact moment you stop clinging. If you made it all the way here, it's because this journey through the void touched something inside you. Maybe an old discomfort, maybe a question that's always been there, or maybe just the desire to see the world with new eyes, with more depth, more awareness, and fewer illusions. The truth is, as we saw with Nagarjuna and so many other thinkers, the void doesn't have to paralyze us. It can transform us. It can be the space where we stop pretending to have all the answers and finally start living with authenticity. If this made sense to you, now it's your turn to act. Like the video that tells YouTube this kind of content is worth showing to more people. Comment below, which idea hit you the hardest today? Share this with someone who's also searching for meaning or learning how to live with the void. And of course, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you can keep diving into this philosophical universe with us. There's a lot more coming, from Nietzsche to Simone Weil, from Camus to Laozi, and with every video, we'll untie one more knot of existence. Stay with us. Here, thinking is not an escape from the world. It's a braver way to live in it. See you in the next video.